Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith, and welcome to the Science Fiction Podcast. It is the 25th of March. It is, I don't know, insert whatever day into quarantine that you are. If you want to call it quarantine, in California they're calling it a shelter in place, so little different, but, you know, we're all managing. This episode, I'm going to be doing a pretty thorough breakdown of the film Snowpiercer. So I just wanted to start off by saying that you can definitely expect some spoilers, not anything like super specific, but generally like the plot of the movie will be, I guess, spoiled. So if you haven't seen it and want to see it and you hate spoilers, it is available. So you could literally just pause the podcast and then watch it and then come right back or something like that if you wanted to. I would recommend it. It's a lot of fun. If you don't care about spoilers, it's just a good in-depth analysis of a film that you might want to watch at some point. And since we're all on quarantine, in quotes, anyway, I figured that now would be a good time to kill some time with a good movie like Snowpiercer. As is becoming kind of like the customary thing around here, I want to make a recommendation at the start of the podcast for some good content to watch, some good sci-fi content. I know last week I spent a lot of time going on and on about things that weren't related to sci-fi, so I do apologize for that, but I do hope that you all checked out some of my recommendations. I am, I think, another 2 or 3 chapters into the Thinking Like a Roman Emperor book, and I've really been enjoying it, so if you've been listening to it, definitely let me know in the comments and let me know your thoughts. And now I'm sure a lot of you who have listened to this podcast or who have been listening to this podcast have already seen this particular recommendation, but regardless, I think that it's worth revisiting or watching for the first time either way. My recommendation this week for y'all is Futurama. It is essentially the spiritual predecessor to Rick and Morty, with writing that's a lot more similar to The Simpsons. There are 7 seasons, all of which I believe are available on Hulu. It was available on Netflix for a really long time, but it's not up there anymore to my knowledge. The series Futurama follows several characters, mainly 2 individuals named Leela and Fry. Fry is the gentleman of Shut Up and Take My Money meme fame, which is pretty funny. And all of the characters are part of an intergalactic delivery service, all of the primary characters. So hijinks and referential humor abound in this series, as does satirical social commentary, all through the excellent use of pretty well-known science fiction tropes and good character development. The show had a couple of different runs on 2 or 3 different networks, and of course they take that in stride, so you can expect some really good "we're canceled" jokes. But overall, I highly recommend watching it, even if you have seen it, and I recommend it even more if you haven't. And if you have seen it and you don't feel like revisiting it, then there's another non-science fiction related suggestion that I have for you. I know, when am I going to stop giving these to you? I have no idea. It's a Netflix original called Disenchanted. I think it has 2 seasons out as of now. I haven't seen another one posted, so I was personally really hesitant to watch it when it first came out because it was/is created by, I think, pretty much the same team and the same head writer as Futurama was, and I didn't want to let that show ruin Futurama for me, because I do really like that. I can talk, I swear. I do really like Futurama. And while there are a lot of similarities, especially in like character design and dynamics, Disenchanted has a more continuous plot line to drive the story forward. And unlike Futurama, you can't really jump around and watch episodes randomly because the plot is really important to the series. Whereas with Futurama, each episode pretty much stands on its own. There's kind of like a continuous storyline between two of the characters, but that's about the only reference that we get to acknowledging things that have happened in the past, which is fun, but I do really like the element of a continuous storyline that they have with Disenchanted. So, getting into the meat of the podcast today, I am going to be breaking down why I enjoyed Snowpiercer enough to spend pretty much an entire podcast on it. Actually, we are going to spend the entire podcast on it. I watched it this weekend with a couple of friends of mine, and just found that it had a really specific philosophical trope that thoroughly pervades the plot of the movie. I apologize. Apparently everything in my show notes today is a tongue twister. And the implications that this film has on the overall genre of science fiction. So, why did I like this movie so much? Well, it's directed by Bong Joon-ho. He is the recent winner of Best Picture for Parasite. And while I would say that artistically Parasite is a superior film, I would argue that Snowpiercer has a superior viewer experience. Plus, Chris Evans and an incredible performance by the actor who plays the dad in Parasite, whose name is Song Kang-ho. Song Kang-ho also plays a dad with questionable parenting skills in this film and does a really good job. In fact, I kind of liked his performance in this particular film a little bit better. The reasoning behind my statement about Snowpiercer being a superior viewing experience is that Snowpiercer is a much more succinct film in its execution when compared to Parasite. There are virtually no unresolved questions at the end of Snowpiercer other than perhaps the ending itself. Parasite has a lot of glazed over plot points that I felt really detracted from the movie overall. And this really weird mixture of fantastic events and superstition with hyper-realistic portrayal of certain aspects of life. One good example is that, like, the family suffers the consequences of certain actions later on in the movie, but the consequences of actions that happen at the very beginning of the movie are never revisited, and they're kind of glazed over, and that, to me, left me feeling very unsatisfied. And the mixture of all of those things, in my opinion, makes the film a fair amount less enjoyable as far as like a viewing experience goes, and leaves the viewer somewhat unsatisfied. And while I will say that there is certainly room to argue that the point of Parasite is to do just that, in this particular case, I believe that it does less for the film rather than more. Normally, I am a big fan of unanswered questions and plot holes for the sake of engaging the viewer. But in this case, I don't feel that the film did a good enough job outside of that to justify its use of those particular storytelling devices. So, irrelevant film critique and comparison aside, Snowpiercer does something particularly well that I feel is worth mentioning and looking at in this episode. Often when critics will go to critique science fiction to decide if it is good or bad, both of which are definitely in air quotes, like good quote or bad quote, they will look at whether or not the story necessitated the medium of science fiction. Which, what I mean is, could the commentary that this story is making, or the human experience that it is attempting to portray, be effectively portrayed via another storytelling genre or medium? Often, for the best works in science fiction, the answer is going to be no. This story could only occur within the universe in which it is portrayed. Some good examples of films or stories that would fall into the category of not meeting those requirements or these requirements are like Star Wars, which you could just as easily have portrayed in like medieval or kind of like a fantasy timeline all you'd have to do really is replace Jedi with monks or knights, lightsabers with swords, and the Force with magic, which the Force is essentially a closed magic system within the Star Wars universe, but we don't need to talk about that. And Dune, which is essentially just medieval science fiction, could also easily have just been medieval. And there's a few others that I could list, but I don't want to spend more time on bad examples. But that, of course, or this one qualifier, of course, doesn't make any works of science fiction bad or other works of science fiction great. A good example of something that would probably fit within the category of needing to be in a science fiction setting is the film The Fifth Element. It can't be portrayed in a non-science fiction form, in my opinion. But that absolutely doesn't make it a great film. It is, of course, a great watch, at least for fun, and it has Gary Oldman and Bruce Willis, so that alone makes it, pretty fun. But I wouldn't necessarily call it a great work of science fiction art. And we are going to take a quick break and then get right back into Snowpiercer.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Hello, welcome back. So right before the break, I was just kind of talking about one of the prerequisites that some critics might include when they are looking at a piece of science fiction or fantasy, and they kind of ask the question, does this have to be in the setting that it is in, or is science fiction just an accessory to help solicit more interest from the audience because it's set in a fantastic setting? And I was about to make the statement that I think that Snowpiercer is a great piece of science fiction art, and it does necessitate the setting and use of science fiction mechanics. The premise of the story is as follows. It is 2031, and the last remaining pocket of humanity has all been locked onto a high-speed train that travels the world in perpetuity on a cyclical route that takes exactly 1 year to complete. Humanity has been locked on this train for 18 years, as in 2013, a chemical was released into the atmosphere that was originally intended to quell the uncontrollable rise of global warming, so global temperatures. However, the chemical proved to be too potent and in fact caused the world's ecosystem to fall into complete and utter ruin and created an incredibly harsh ice age that made it impossible for supposedly any life to live on the surface of the planet. The few survivors that could acquire a ticket or something, they didn't say anything specific, to board the train, are believed to be the only remaining individuals of the entire human race. The train has its own social hierarchy based on the positioning of the cars, and as the train is a mile long, there are a lot of cars, all of which we do not see, but that's okay because that's not what the film is about. As is expected, the closer to the engine you are, the higher in class you are, with the conductor/engineer named Wilfred. We'll mention more on that later. He is at the top of this pecking order. The story follows Chris Evans, whose character's name is Curtis, as he journeys to uproot the social structures of the train in order to reestablish a new, more egalitarian approach to living on the train. Curtis lives on the back of the train, the literal last car, and as such, he and all of the individuals there live in overcrowded filth and tight quarters. They are fed with some sort of ground up protein blocks that hypothetically meet their required dietary needs. He has some memories of life off the train, but not many. And he really is the classic reluctant hero/leader of a rebellion that intends to take over the train. I will say that the consistent trope of, no, I'm not a good leader, coming from Curtis, juxtaposed against the fact that he is very clearly the leader, did not help this film. But I'm not going to talk myself out of liking it because of some subpar character development, because I really don't think that the character development or even necessarily the characters are what make this a good film. And that is something that is unique to this particular director. It seems like the overall story or the message that he's sending with whatever it is that he is, filming for us or portraying for us on screen is more important than the individual's stories within the actual plot. As is to be expected, a lot of this film relies on symbolism to convey metaphoric overtones or undertones, connotations, whatever you want to call it, within the themes of the film. One of these themes is, in a way, the creation narrative. But in some way, it's kind of more like a rebirth narrative through the lens of the creation narrative, if that makes sense, because this is like a new world. Humanity's been destroyed by an ice age, cough, cough, a flood. So, a little bit of a biblical reference there. Though I would argue more for the case of it being a creation narrative rather than a rebirth narrative. There is a specifically recurring symbol that they use pretty effectively to portray this like rebirth idea, and that symbol is fire. After the initial assault on the regime is put into motion by Curtis and his group of ragtag underdogs, we are introduced to a new character. He is the security expert who will help open the doors between cars to advance the rebellion through the train in order to eventually reach the engine compartment. As the character is awakened from his containment cell, we find out that he has in his possession the last 2 cigarettes on the entire planet. He wakes up and, obviously he lights one. And I think it's funny that they mention Marlboro Lights. Ew, gross. It's just interesting that they would comment on the brand of cigarette, and everybody is super surprised that he has one. And this is the first instance of the symbol of fire in the film. It comes immediately after the prisoner, whose name is Namgung Minsu. I don't know if they mention his nationality. I want to say it was Korean. He is of Asian descent. But he is the first character to show us, fire, and it is after he is removed from a prison cell, so pretty obvious symbolism for rebirth there. And the big reason that fire stood out to me is because I think that it is an allusion that they use throughout the film specifically to the character Prometheus of Greek mythology. Prometheus in Greek mythology brings fire as a gift to humankind after Zeus destroys the world with a flood. Zeus decides that humanity is just too far gone and they need a hard reset, so Zeus destroys most of humanity with a flood. That might sound very familiar to other religious beliefs, so take that with a grain of salt. But after Zeus has completed his task of essentially hitting the reset button on civilization, Prometheus brings fire to man. Though brings is a bit of a nice way of saying this, as really Prometheus steals fire to give to the humans so that the humans can develop society again after being wiped out. And the real reason that I think that this is such like a dead ringer illusion is because Prometheus is punished pretty harshly and pretty memorably for giving fire to man. Zeus punishes him with a pretty terrible fate. Prometheus is bound to a rock in the underworld where every day a buzzard comes and eats out, I think it's his liver, because Prometheus is immortal. Of course, his body regenerates, and he has to then face that trial again the next day. The reason that I mention this specifically is because ultimately every person who uses fire in a way to advance the cause of the uprising is punished by death from the established order. There's even a scene where they are running with torches, and I think that's pretty reminiscent of Prometheus bringing mankind fire via a bunch of fennel. And this powerful illusion is used to great effect and is a relatively common trope in science fiction. The idea that new knowledge or rebirth is the way by which something better can be created is generally punished when it comes to science fiction. And I mean a lot of just fiction in general. And whether this is something that's intrinsic to the human race or something that is simply a product of social orders is kind of yet to be determined. That might be too abstract of a concept to say that it's an absolute. But I would argue that that is a universal aspect of humanity. Individuals within a society that adopt a set of ideas are evolutionarily driven by emotion to perpetuate those ideas, especially if they believe that those ideas make them necessary. We, as a species, have a subconscious desire to necessitate our own existence. And by perpetuating certain hierarchical structures and social ideas, large swaths of individuals believe they are able to achieve necessitation for their own existence. Now, another theme in this film, which is related to my previous statement, in kind of a more nefarious way, is the idea of the great chain of being. Now, for those of you who can only remember that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, this should be something that's familiar to you. Though I will say pretty much everybody who I talked to about it, who I went to high school with, doesn't really know a ton about it, which I think is funny, but regardless. It's one of those kind of random factoids or belief systems that a lot of schools include in their curriculum, and it will definitely be on the final exam type of a thing. The great chain of being posits that some external force has created a hierarchy-based system that dictates the roles of individuals in society. This is a pervasive belief system in a lot of Eastern countries, especially in India, and it was the dominant belief structure for society throughout most of civilization, both Eastern and Western. And to a degree, it still has vestiges in our current Western society, though arguably we are more mired in a great chain of work-based system, and that is based off of a puritanical work ethic and value system. But I'm sure that we'll have a podcast on that at some point in the future, so I'm just going to leave that there. Or will I? I don't know. Find out after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Right before the break, I was about to launch into a diatribe on social, historic commentary about the fact that the United States as a culture is mired in the puritanical great chain of work, where one's work determines one's value. And I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that to you. This is a sci-fi podcast. If you want to read more about that, then I think check out Howard Zinn. I never got all the way through his one famous book that guy in Lady Bird is reading that makes him cool. But at least I think the film's called Lady Bird. It's that it was based in Sacramento, so it was a big deal around here because I'm from Sacramento. But no, I haven't finished that book, so I'm not going to get into that. I am not a well-educated enough person to comment on that, at least not in that specific subject. So back to the Great Chain of Being, which is what I had mentioned previously. Or if you're talking about the Great Chain of Being in something that's Eastern, you're probably going to find it as more of like a caste system. It's basically a system used by individuals in power to not only maintain power, but also to give meaning to those who lack. It posits that if you are poor or destitute, that your purpose in life or society is to be poor and destitute, which gives individuals who are experiencing that particular kind of adversity reason to believe that despite their terrible situation, they at least have purpose. This purpose helps to perpetuate the different castes and social trophic levels in a way that discourages uprising or rebellion because it deters individuals from believing that there could possibly be any more for them than what they have. So why uproot the current system as it would ultimately solicit the same results? And this is something, and I will go on a little bit of a philosophy aside here. I do apologize. This is something that like Nietzsche rails pretty heavily against. Now, Nietzsche would argue that morality or ethics are used by the weak to control the strong, but he would say that religion is a way by which individuals are prevented from self-actualizing because it creates a nihilistic world in which your current situation doesn't matter, because if you fulfill your purpose of your current situation, which could be to be a poor, destitute individual who experiences no joy throughout their life, if you complete that purpose, then there is reward after this life. So it's nihilistic in the way that it removes the point of living, so it prevents self-actualization. So just to bring a little bit of Nietzsche into here, because I mean, what conversation doesn't need a little bit of Nietzsche, in my opinion? And as I mentioned before, this idea, the idea of the Great Chain of Being, is often perpetuated using an appeal to religious beliefs. And what we as westernized civilization would be most familiar with would be the biblical justification that was used throughout Europe prior to the inception of things like the Magna Carta, which implied that every individual had certain rights regardless of birth. Previously, those rights were not necessarily allotted to individuals of low birth because it was believed that in some capacity God had destined them to be of low birth. The biblical justification essentially said that God had placed certain individuals in charge and given them gifts that necessitated their place above others sociologically and economically. That is not necessarily the case in Snowpiercer, though they do kind of try to make it seem like the engine is holy or Wilfred is holy or sanctified. I would say that like by the root definition of the word, that being that holy means set apart, he is in a way because he is in isolation from everybody, but they're not using a religious appeal to convince people, and if they are, they're not using it very effectively to convince people that the Great Chain of Being, is a good thing. They're saying that the Great Chain of Being is being perpetuated as a form of balance or equilibrium that's driven equally by the utilitarian ideas held by Winston as it is by anything else. So, skipping over a ton of stuff in the middle of the film, much like in The Matrix, we find out that the individual who has been orchestrating rebellions and such, because there is mention of several previous rebellions, is actually the person who is running the entire operation. And we find that the rebellions and uprisings have all had purposes that served the needs of Wilfred, who believes that he has the interests and needs of the majority in mind. In this particular case, those needs are for ecological balance on the train. The rebellions serve as a way of keeping the population at a very specific number in order to support life on the train as it currently is. Essentially, it's an excuse to have a murder party. In addition, we find out that the reason that children have gone missing because there is a scene earlier in the movie where they take a couple of children from the back of the train, is because children are the only individuals who can complete a specific task on the train due to their size. And there is also a lot of mention throughout the film of like, oh, you can only eat this much of this particular thing at this particular time, because if we eat it at any other time or in too much quantity, then it will cease to exist because the balance will have been ruined. And there's just kind of this dark undertone. I think they do a pretty good job of foreshadowing the like twist at the end that I just mentioned, which is good and bad. You know, take it for what it is. But this idea is where things get really interesting, as if the rest of the film wasn't. There is no morality or ethical code by which Winston completes the actions of inciting rebellion in order to, cull the population that would make sense to other individuals, which is why he is shrouded in secrecy and kept in isolation at the front of the train. He does have some contact with another individual who is a part of the rebellion, but that's, I'm not going to spoil everything. But the access that Winston has to knowledge that nobody else has is outside of the realm of familiarity, and it affirms him as the alien, in my opinion, of the film, or at least his ideas are the alien part of the film. Winston is acting out of a form of utilitarianism, which is a formal philosophical belief structure that is defined as the doctrine that an action is right insofar as it promotes happiness, and that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the guiding principle of conduct. And that definition is from, basically, it's a system of philosophy proposed by Jeremy Bentham, because he believed that the greatest possible good for the greatest number of people was an axiomic principle by which morality and ethics could be defined. That is to say, that if it benefits the largest number of people, then it is good, and any other option is not good. A very common kind of like counter-argument or thought experiment to this particular idea is the philosophical conundrum of the trolley, and I'm sure that we've seen a lot of memes lately. There's one specific one that I'm thinking of that talks about the current market economy. But the idea behind the philosophical conundrum of the trolley is something that I will go over right after this last commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi podcast. Right before the break, I basically started outlining the idea of the philosophical conundrum that's commonly known as like the trolley. Basically, the trolley posits the following scenario. You are riding on a trolley that is careening down the tracks. Or actually, no, I apologize. You're standing next to the tracks, and there's a trolley careening down the tracks. If you pull a switch, then it will redirect the trolley from a cliff to another track, and everybody on the trolley will survive. But there is an individual who is tied to the tracks who cannot escape that trolley, who will die, but everyone on board the trolley will survive. If you do nothing, then the trolley goes careening off a cliff and everybody in it will most assuredly die. The utilitarianism argument says, well, of course, you pull the lever, because if you can save 10 for the cost of 1, then you have done the morally right thing. Now, obviously, there's a lot more depth to that particular philosophical conundrum, and I'm sure that there are philosophers who have written entire books or doctorate theses or series of books or based their entire life's philosophy off of this one conundrum. I'm not going to give you my answer as to what I would do, but I just will say that that is a trope that we kind of see frequently throughout not only Snowpiercer, but a lot of other science fiction, especially science fiction horror or science fiction survivalist novels. And that idea is pretty heavy-handedly portrayed in the way that life goes on the train in Snowpiercer, which is funny that they are on a train. And that's a big philosophical, like a commonly known philosophical trope. So they keep individuals in the back of the train in tight quarters with minimal food supply and steal their children to complete jobs at the front of the train. Also, that the majority of individuals on board can continue on as they are, which is, of course, debatable as being the best good for the greatest number. But when you mix the idea of utilitarianism in with the idea of the great chain of being, then you get this weird ethical dilemma where it does, in fact, become to the benefit of the greatest number for things to continue as they are, because this caste system is in itself also believed to be an absolute good. So now we have these mixtures of a system of justification for the caste system, but also a system of justification for the perpetuation of that caste system, because it is a great chain of being that is absolute. So in order for everybody within it to be happy, it must be maintained. So the sacrifice of individuals within that system becomes not morally reprehensible, because the system overall is more important to be perpetuated than the individual lives of people within that system. And the thing that makes that truly alien is that Wilford has removed the individuality from a group of people in society and has turned them into a resource, no different ultimately than livestock or any other resource that's on the train. This is, of course, nothing new to humanity. It's something that a lot of tribalist or nationalist, etc., societies have done for hundreds of years, and it is unlikely that this type of thing won't happen again as humanity continues on, as that it is pretty apparent that that too is part of the human experience. And that statement, part of the human experience, is really why I think that I enjoyed this film as much as I did, because it does a really good job of taking meaningful philosophical ideas and applying them to universal aspects of the human experience thematically through metaphor, symbolism, and plot. Now, before we wrap this all up in a nice little bow, I wanted to mention something that was pointed out to me by a good friend when I talked with him about this particular movie. So while Snowpiercer is certainly great, it is also in a way, and this is kind of a funny thought, just if you've seen the movie or you just watched it, just would like you to kind of think about this. It is just a much more horrifying version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which I thought about talking about on this particular podcast, but it just didn't have the same level of gravitas. And by on this podcast, I mean like on this episode. So the reason that I am proposing this hilarious / crazy idea is that the story's main spiritual guide is a mysterious hermit savant whose name starts with W, and he's a savant at one thing and one thing only: trains. He employs a minority group of individuals with virtually no discernible compensation to that group of individuals. In Willy Wonka, that's Oompa Loompas. In this particular movie, it is small children. And an individual is forced to go through a number of trials and lose people around him in order to prove his worthiness for the ability or opportunity to take over the operation of the train. Oh, yeah, I should mention the train is pretty much just the glass elevator. There are even golden tickets hidden inside black bars, which I think come in the form of like small notes hidden in the protein blocks that the people at the back of the train eat. And this is, of course, not to say that the film is bad or even that it's a problem, just to notice some striking similarities that are, in my opinion, a little too coincidental for me to not say anything about them. So if you've just watched this movie, or you still haven't yet, or you watched it a while ago, I really recommend checking it out again with a new lens, and those ideas in mind so that you can comment and let me know more similarities between Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory and their fantastic romp through a children's paradise that is kind of marred by brief little tragedies and mysterious disappearances, in contrast to a dystopian film where people are literally being used as a human cows, essentially. So, would just like to wrap it up and say thank you again for joining me this week, everybody. I really hope that you enjoyed the content. I have written in my show notes to do standard outro. So, standard outro. I'm just kidding. If you listen to any of the other podcasts that I do this thing where I make these really dry jokes, and they hit much better when you have a co-host, but when it's just you and you have to sit there in silence after you've delivered this dry joke, it is just nowhere near as enjoyable as it is to see the reaction of my co-host. So I hope that you all stay safe out there. Check out the other podcasts on the GSMC Podcast Network. And I hope that you will follow the guidelines outlined by your particular living area so that we can all do our part to get things back to normal as soon as possible. Thanks again for listening. Definitely like, subscribe, leave us a review, or leave me a review rather. Let me know in the comments if you're listening to that book I recommended last week, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, or if you watched this movie and completely disagree with me and think that it's garbage, or if you're interested in hearing me do more breakdowns on specific content like this. Reviews are the place to do that. Twitter is also a good way to reach me, so give us a like and follow us on Twitter and then tweet at us. So yeah, good luck everybody. Stay safe out there and have a great week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.